Today we're talking about Rage, or the item Rage more specifically. The crit item that was changed in the most recent patch. What was the change? It has a new passive. So the stats of Rage are now a price tag of 2,400 gold, 30 physical power and 20% critical strike chance. So far so good, nothing too crazy here. What is impactful is the passive. The passive now is killing or getting an assist on an enemy guard gives you 1 stack. Each stack provides 1% critical strike chance. Stacks are permanent and stack up to 5 times. At 5 stacks, you get an additional 10% critical strike chance. This in itself sounds pretty interesting. It's a mechanic that works off kills or assists, so the stacks are not that hard to get. They are not always that easy either though. In a game where you're already falling behind, it's gonna be risky to go into an item that requires you to get assists or kills to become more effective. Just how much of a difference in effectiveness that makes is something we'll look into in this video. We'll look at all the numbers in detail. What's important to note here is that it actually gives you 15% additional critical strike chance. From the way you read it, it could also be just 10%, but it is actually 15%. So the total critical strike chance is 35% when Rage is fully stacked. The stacks are completely permanent, so they're not gonna get lost in any situation once you have them. So effectively, if we're talking about a fully stacked item here, we're always talking about a 35% crit chance. 35% critical strike chance is something that sounds very, very strong when you hear about it. I did originally think that Rage would, because of that, be the best crit item to build in a 2 crit build, simply because of the fact that it gives you so much extra crit chance to enhance any effect any other item would have. But as usual, things are not that simple. The item I chose to compare Rage to was Wind Demon for a few reasons. The first one being a certain similarity in price. While Wind Demon is still more expensive than Rage, it is not as much of a difference as, for example, Malice or Deathbringer. And secondly, because it is also a crit item that you usually don't want to build as a single crit item. It's a crit item that works better if you have another item that basically supports this crit item, and that's when it reaches its highest effectiveness, so it's kind of a build-up to another crit item. While Poison Star is price-wise closer to Rage, it is not the best item if you're looking for DPS, so it wasn't really that useful for this comparison. Poison Star is not favored as much anymore since its nerf, and usually you will see Wind Demon over it, so it makes more sense to put the item that you will usually see being used by most people to the test. Poison Star would be significantly lower when it comes to the DPS, but that's because of the passive that has other effects that kind of affect the enemy more, so you can't really compare it one to one. In order to do these comparisons, I made a few conditions. Those are very obvious ones that just function with how the items work. Condition 1 was simply Wind Demon without its passive. Condition 2 was Wind Demon with the activated passive with the steroid. Condition 3 was Rage with no stacks. And Condition 4 was Rage with full stacks. There are obviously in-between conditions where Rage has a few stacks, but I wanted to see how far this item can go, and the in-between values are not that important, as you'll find out later on. What I did then was put these items into various builds. For example, a build with Warrior Tabi, a build with Ninja Tabi, a build with an additional attack speed item, and so on. And it tested how the DPS values in those particular builds changed. One thing that I could not factor in was the extra movement speed from Wind Demon. This is worth pointing out. This is a strong benefit of the item that it has over Rage, but obviously it doesn't really work in DPS calculations. So keep that in mind with everything else considered here. The first build I did was one that just tried to reach crit as fast as possible, with completely skipping things like lifesteal and so on. So the build was Death Toll, Warrior Tabi, Executioner, and then the crit item of your choice. In this very simple scenario, Wind Demon kinda came out on top. Wind Demon started at 320 DPS, whereas Rage with no stacks had 301 DPS, and the amped up Wind Demon had 357 DPS versus 337 on Rage. Now what's worth keeping in mind here is obviously Rage maintains the full stacks, but as it starts with less stacks, you can expect that even like until you get to the point of full stacks, you will usually be at lower DPS compared to Wind Demon, because you really need to get those full stacks with a 10% extra crit chance first in order to increase your DPS over Wind Demon, and that takes quite a while. The same could be played out with Deathbringer. Here Wind Demon would have 520 DPS, 582 with a steroid, whereas Rage has 490 and 556 when fully stacked. With the Ram steroid, if we activate that, because this was done on a Ram versus a Ra level 20, you would get extra 30 DPS on Rage over Wind Demon. This is because you already have a lot of attack speed through the Wind Demon, and that's how the DPS with Wind Demon is created mostly. And, well, Rage works off higher hitting basic through the higher crit chance instead of extra attack speed, so if you combine those stats, the attack speed will benefit you more. The same can be seen if looking at Ninja Tabi instead of Warrior Tabi. I'm not going to read out all the values here, you can just see them for yourself. But what you will notice is that the DPS increase swings slightly in favor of Rage in comparison to Wind Demon in the Warrior Tabi build, simply due to the fact that you don't benefit as much from getting more attack speed when you already have more attack speed in regards to your DPS. So in the end, you will have some more DPS with Ninja Tabi either way, obviously in return for a slightly awkward power curve as usual. The next build that I tried was throwing in Ninja Tabi and Ekival and Executioner, so a very high attack speed build. With Wind Demon we had a DPS of 474, then with a steroid 518, whereas Rage started at 453 and ended up at 509. So even here, with this ton of attack speed, Wind Demon was still on top. Even when we got Deathbringer after that, the DPS of Wind Demon would stay higher. It would start at 765, go up to 834 with the steroid, whereas Rage had 730 and went up to 828. In an attempt to maximize the DPS out of Rage as opposed to Wind Demon with a steroid, I tried out some more things where I tried to see what happens if I put on the Ram steroid with a build that favors Rage in general, being Death Toll, Warrior Tabi, Ekival and Executioner, or the same with Deathbringer on top of that. In that scenario, Wind Demon had 625 DPS and Rage had 638 DPS at full stacks versus full steroid. When not building Deathbringer, with Deathbringer, Wind Demon had 989 DPS, whereas Rage went up to 1019 DPS. So what you can see here, if you look at all these values, is the damage difference between the two items is not crazy. It is definitely there, and it's definitely something worth pointing out. But more than anything, it seems to come down to preference. With Wind Demon, you can reach higher DPS, and if you have a solid crit chance, that obviously works, but it's a gamble. Now the thing is, if you're actually looking to go into crit, you're probably looking to gamble anyways, because that's how crit works. Crit in itself is a gamble. So if you're saying, hey, I want to gamble and I might as well gamble a little more, then why not go for Wind Demon? Because it's usually the max DPS you can get, unless you have such special circumstances as Ram steroid, where more attack speed will not benefit you anymore, simply due to the fact that you may overcap or something like that. So in that regard, Wind Demon kinda wins. If you want more consistent DPS, however, then Rage can help you more. Because as soon as it has the stacks, the DPS is consistently higher than Wind Demon's until it procs. Now, the question is, do you want consistent DPS? And if yes, why are you building crit then? It doesn't really make sense in that context. The other issue that Rage has is that if you fall behind and your team gets bullied out and you don't get the assists, the effect is relatively weak. Until you have the stacks on the item, Rage is kinda eh. And some games really make it hard for you to get those stacks. It's not always the case, and usually team fights will turn that for you, but it can happen, and that's why you have to get Rage relatively early as well, which kind of makes it harder too, so there's a lot of downsides to picking it in general. As such, more than ever before, you can really say, you can choose this item if you want to, but you really don't have to. It is a matter of playstyle, it's a matter of risk versus reward, and the choice can really be made from game to game and character to character. I would like to point out here, because this has been asked as well, if Rage should be built on Mercury. And I would say, based on these statistics, probably not. Mercury gets additional extra damage through the movement speed, and with that, there's really no reason to go into Rage over it, unless you're looking for a triple crit and you want that as your third crit item or whatever, but with 2 crit items, you should definitely not include Rage, and even with 3, I might probably consider just going for a heavier hitting one instead. Because at that point you will have a high crit chance and you easily get effects anyways. While the movement speed bonus that I mentioned earlier is something that should not be underrated in the context of Wind Demon, you also have to keep in mind that Wind Demon is 400 gold more expensive. So basically, I would say you're kind of paying for that extra movement speed with that extra gold if you're looking for that. So another thing worth mentioning. And this basically goes for assassins as well. If you're looking for other assassins that could go crit, which aren't too many, you will often have to consider if you really want more crit or if the additional movement speed isn't more beneficial for you as an assassin who has a harder time sticking to a target in many scenarios anyways. The last thing to note is that Rage is pretty much harder to play than Wind Demon. That is due to the fact that you have less hits. A lot of the DPS from Wind Demon come out of the extra attack speed it provides you with, whereas with Rage you will have less attack speed, meaning your single basics will be hitting harder, but you will not have to throw out as many basics, or you will not be able to throw out as many basics, meaning if you miss a basic, it will cost you more. It's more of a loss for you. Likewise, the movement penalty reduction that you get through more attack speed is not going to be as much for you, so you really have to hit your basics if you want to get the maximum benefit out of Rage. Is Rage better than it was before? Definitely. Should you always buy it? No. Should you choose depending on the situation and your playstyle? Yes. And with that, thank you for watching. I hope this was insightful, I hope this was informative. If you enjoyed this video, do not click the subscribe button, do not click the like, do not share this video with your friends, and do not comment on it either. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.